Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story tonight concerns the tug of war in Senate over President Biden's infrastructure bill. All eyes are on the Senate. U.S. President Joe Biden is meeting Republican senators halfway by reducing the cost of his infrastructure bill. This is despite the fact that Democrats are calling for $2.3 trillion package to be even bigger. The dynamics of this conversation is driven by Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough. She's allowing Democrats to sidestep a GOP filibuster one more time in 2021. With an evenly divided Senate, the threat of a filibuster is a powerful weapon in the hands of a minority. This is forcing President Biden to seek dialogue and compromise with the Republicans. Democratic lawmakers are rethinking how they can advance the president's agenda. They plan to include the infrastructure bill with other initiatives they want passed in 2021. 300 groups are organizing protests in support of Indigenous communities who oppose the Line 3 tar sands pipeline in Minnesota. The $2.9 billion project has brought in thousands of workers. They're staying in hotels and campgrounds on or near native reserves. These individuals are allegedly tied to over 40 reports of sexual harassment and abuse of local Indigenous women. The Canadian company Enbridge is building the pipeline. Violence prevention advocates had warned state officials of the risk before the pipeline was approved. They said there is a proven link between workers in extractive industries and increased sexual violence. In Maine, a Native American tribe is buying back an island taken from them 160 years ago. It is the latest in a series of successful land back campaigns for Indigenous people in the United States. Eric Adams and Andrew Yang are amongst the frontrunners in the New York Democratic mayoral primary. The elections are scheduled for June 22nd. The winner of the heavily Democratic New York City in the primary will surely win the election for mayor in November. Eric Adams invested heavily in outreach to the Muslim community. However, both Adams and Yang issued strong statements in support of Israel during its bombing campaign last month. They expressed little sympathy for the Palestinians, who made up the vast majority of over 200 victims killed by Israel. This has resulted in both candidates heavily losing Muslim support. New York City has an estimated 769,000 Muslims. In international news, Muslims living near a Hindu temple in the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh allege that they're being pressured to leave their homes. About a dozen families in the Indian city of Gorakhpur say they were forced to sign a consent letter to give up their homes and land for the security of Gorakhnath Temple. Al Jazeera reports that the government and police are involved in forcing Muslims out of their ancestral homes. The state's chief minister, Adityanath, is also the chief priest of the Gorakhnath Temple. The state is now threatening to detain reporters under the National Security Act laws for reporting on the Muslim families' evictions. Reporters Without Borders has placed India at the 142nd in the world for freedom of press. 16 Chinese military aircraft flew over Malaysian waters off the coast of the Malaysian eastern state of Sarawak. Malaysian fighter jets immediately scrambled to intercept Chinese transport planes over the South China Sea. Malaysia says it will summon the Chinese ambassador. It described the maneuver as a serious threat to national sovereignty. China maintains its aircrafts abided by international law. In March this year, the Philippines had called on China to withdraw more than 200 ships which had encroached upon their territorial waters. China claims the whole South China Sea as its territory. The claim is disputed by Malaysia and other countries within the region. U.S. warships have passed through the South China Sea with increasing frequency in recent years. It is a show of force against China's claims. A statement published in Scientific American magazine highlights violations of international law by Israel under the Fourth Geneva Convention. The letter says that Israel continues to deny essential healthcare resources to Palestinians. The statement points out that 60% of Israelis are vaccinated in comparison to 5% of Palestinians. Chinese hackers are targeting Uyghur Muslims in China and Pakistan. The hackers posed as members of the United Nations to send fake malware documents and websites attempting to identify Uyghur Muslims. Hackers are particularly targeting human rights activists seeking grants. The fake websites pretend to represent reputable organizations such as the Turkic Culture and Heritage Foundation. Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh claim that the country's government is preventing their access to a visiting United Nations delegation. The UN's team was visiting Bhashanchar Island, where Rohingya refugees are recently transferred by the Bangladeshi government. Rohingya Muslim refugees claim that they were beaten by Bangladeshi police to prevent them from talking to the UN. Refugees have complained about living conditions on the remote Bangladeshi island. They say they're not allowed to work, fish in the sea, or leave the island. Meanwhile, Burmese military leader Min Aung Hlaing cast doubt on the return of Rohingyas to their homeland. Rohingyas are the indigenous people of Burma who fled genocide at the hands of the Burmese army almost 4 years ago. They took refuge in neighboring Bangladesh. Studies have shown a clear bias in mainstream media reports around Palestine. However, a new study blames the New York Times specifically for distorting the Palestinian struggle. More in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
Bias against Arabs, Muslims, and especially Palestine have always been a hot topic in scientific research. A new study by Holly Jackson focused on the first and second Palestinian Intifada. Its findings demonstrated the New York Times' bias against the Palestinian struggle for freedom. Research showed that the New York Times reported deaths in Israel 2.8 times higher than Palestine deaths. In addition, only 18% of Palestinian children's deaths were reported, while 125% of Israeli children's deaths were reported at the same time. The researcher analyzed over 33,000 New York Times articles for their use of active and passive voice. The study also paid attention to the objectivity, tone, and violent sentiment of the language. The researcher used state-of-the-art natural language processing tools. She carefully validated word bank as well as regression model with over 90% accuracy. The study shows that anti-Palestinian bias persisted disproportionately in the New York Times during both periods. In fact, the bias worsened from the first Intifada to the second.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Minneapolis City Crews removed concrete barriers around the South Minneapolis intersection where George Floyd was killed more than a year ago. The disruption of the memorial site prompted local activists, some of whom are very angry, and responded by erecting makeshift barricades. Meanwhile, a report of another shooting just came out of these events. To get latest updates, let's go to Saleha Farouk, who is with the Deputy Director of CARE Minnesota, Mohammed Ibrahim. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you so much, Hena. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Mohammed Ibrahim, who is the Deputy Director of CARE Minnesota. Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us on short notice to talk about an important event in your community.
No, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for making some time for us today.
Wa alaikum salam. If you can first begin by telling us a little bit about the dismantling of the George Floyd Square, where it happened, when it happened, and what are the current events on the ground right now?
Yes, so around 5 a.m. Yesterday morning, the city of Minneapolis sent dozens of city workers, bulldozers, and other equipment to George Floyd Square, and that's with the idea and the attempt to remove mementos, signs, and other precious items that were left by visitors, as well as the barricades that surrounded the square that impeded from oncoming traffic to flow in and run through the square. And the actions of the city officials to disrupt and dismantle a sacred memorial site and to get back to his business as usual was not only traumatizing and inhumane, but it was extremely and highly disturbing.
Precisely. If you could tell us a little bit about the community response and how this sudden event might have affected or impacted the community at large in the area.
Well, it was really traumatizing to make this attempt to reopen the street, especially without meeting the demands of the caregivers and the caretakers at the George Floyd Square. And one thing about them thinking that they're opening the street, but what they're doing is really trying to erase the history and the pain of the last places that George Floyd, took his last breaths. And George Floyd Square has not only become a local, but a national and international place for healing, not only to memorize the life of George Floyd, but the many others across the state of Minnesota and across the nation that have been killed by police and police violence, and is also a place of resistance against oppression. It's a place of resistance against racism and white supremacy. And literally, there is no other place like George Floyd Square across the world.
Now, obviously, yourself and your team, you're dealing with a lot of events that are going on right now. Recently, there was another shooting that involved a number of local law enforcement agencies in Minneapolis. Can you tell us about how the dismantling of the George Floyd Square might have led to what you're currently dealing with today?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it led, but it really echoes to the importance of the space, right? So a few hours after the city's attempt to dismantle the space, and community gathered, made sure that the space was really reconstructed to the way that it was, and also to preserve, and heal after the traumatizing event. We learned that there was an officer-involved shooting that happened later on in the day around the lake and Girard, and the details of that incident still unfolding, but it really echoes to what community has been saying, is that state-sanctioned violence is not only not welcomed, but it really needs to be stopped at all levels. And outside of accountability, we really need transparency, because right now we're still learning about the details that happened, and the family is also wondering about the details, and we're still awaiting for the details to emerge. But it shouldn't have to be results or details coming out after public outcry. It should be something automatic that we expect, especially if it's agencies that are getting paid by our taxpayer dollars to serve us. We shouldn't have to demand and pull and tug to get details about how a family member lost his life, and those details should be displayed and expeditedly given to the grieving family members, without having them to jump through this legal red tape and this administrative BS that we're really seeing. But the fight really continues, and this is what some of the demands that were being pushed by the members of the George Floyd Square, and some of the resolutions that they were pushing for, and some of the resolutions that we're pushing for at a state level through policy, is to making sure that families have the ability to get access to body-worn cameras within 48 hours after incidents, rather than having them demand and go out in front of cameras, re-traumatizing themselves, and through the grieving process, asking for transparency.
Now, we know that it's been approximately 1 year since the anniversary of George Floyd's death, and his murderer was found guilty in court. If you can talk to us a little bit about, after the guilty verdict, what are people perhaps protesting? What is the reason behind this violence 1 year after the fact, when people right now are actually trying to commemorate his memory?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is that a guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin is partial justice. There are still three other officers that are yet to go to trial. We do have federal indictments that we're waiting to hear back for, hopefully early in the fall, as well as the sentencing still has not occurred yet in the trial of Derek Chauvin. So justice has not been served. We've only seen partial justice in terms of a conviction, but we still have a long way to go in terms of demanding and receiving justice for the Floyd family, as well as getting some accountability for the police officers. And after that, we really have to talk about the system which allowed Derek Chauvin to be not only it's murder, right? He's been convicted of murder that allowed him to murder somebody comfortably. And what we all witnessed to be a public lynching, a modern day public lynching of George Floyd. What were the systems that were in place that allowed Derek Chauvin to be comfortable, and what could we do to make sure that never happens again? And the state did not pass any meaningful legislation, because while we are on the tail end of the George Floyd, the person that murdered George Floyd, Derek Chauvin's trial, we did lose another community member by the name of Dante Wright to also police violence, where an officer allegedly, fired her gun instead of firing her taser, right? And we still need to have policies in place, and we are thankful and grateful for the work that the Brooklyn Center city officials put in to make sure that there were some solutions to end non-traffic violation stops by armed police officers. But it took 3 Black city officials to make these changes happen, and we have yet to see anything happen at the state level. We have yet to see anything happen at the city level in terms of the city of Minneapolis. But I think the biggest thing is that we still have a long way to go. I think there was a moment to celebrate that, yes, we did get a little bit of justice, but we are still fighting to get true justice. We are fighting to get true accountability, and we are trying to ensure that nobody else gets to experience or go through what the Floyd family went through. Nobody else goes through what George Floyd went through, Dante Wright, and so many others. We're talking about the 400 plus that lost their lives since the year 2000. And really, this is a moment of a beacon of hope. And maybe Minnesota can be the North Star to the rest of the country in terms of how we are able to get some accountability and continue to fight for the rest of it.
Now, CARE Minnesota is currently dealing with a lot of new developments in regards to the recent shootings. Can you talk to us a little bit about the loss of life that might have occurred?
I think the first thing that we have to remember is that somebody lost his life at the end of the day. And not only do the state and everybody around the incident owes the family the due diligence process that is necessary to help the family grieve, but also to provide all of the necessary information revolving around how the family member lost his life. And that begins with releasing body-worn cameras or police footage showing the incident that led up to, in this case, Winston Smith, how he lost his life. And we are pushing for legislation that allows the state to, and puts in measures requiring the city officials or state officials to display body-worn cameras and releasing all of the data and metadata revolving the incident, so that the families within 48 hours get to review the footage to see what happened to their loved ones, as well as other policies like ending the statute of limitations that limits the families' time in terms of how long they can fight. And then also other policies like allowing cities to have civilian oversight committees, so that cities, if they choose to, could have a civilian oversight committees that can subpoena, that can investigate outside of of the current systems that we have, as well as understanding that 60% of incidents that result in violence response from police officers are mental health calls and mental health response calls. And we want to make sure that we end police-only mental health response calls. And we do have a bill at the state level as well that allows for mental health practitioners and professionals to be the first to respond to the calls to de-escalate, because we've seen them de-escalate. Individuals like Dylan Roof, who went inside a church and killed 9 members. We've seen the individual that went on the onslaught of them murdering individuals in the Asian businesses in Atlanta, yet they were able to apprehend those individuals without a scratch on them. And matter of fact, with Dylan Roof, he was given Burger King on the way to there. But when it comes to them responding to Black and brown bodies that are receiving a mental health crisis call, oftentimes more than not, it results in death. And we know that it's not a matter of training, but a matter of will, whether they are choosing to or not. And we need policies that forces them to do and act justly, rather than us putting our trust and faith in a system that continues to fail us.
Mohammed Ibrahim, who is the Deputy Director of CARE Minnesota. Mohammed, thank you so much for your time today, your courage and solidarity. We wish you and your community the best.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time. Salam.
Wa alaikum salam. And back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha and Mohammed Ibrahim. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. In our show last night, we shared a story about the newly formed coalition of Israeli political parties. This coalition has an agreement to form a new government and oust Benjamin Netanyahu. To discuss the significance of this development, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. Media is talking for a while about the change in Israeli leadership. They have a new president and they're looking for a new prime minister, and back and forth, constant media coverage. Will it make any difference? Will it help end apartheid in Israel and occupied Palestine? We have Professor Stephen Zunas to discuss that with us. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Great to be with you again.
Professor Zunas is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. Tell us, is this a good news for peace?
Unfortunately, it doesn't make much of a difference either way for peace. I mean, it's good news for a lot of Israelis if they indeed get rid of Netanyahu, his corruption, his rather authoritarian tendencies and the like have made it very problematic for more liberal-minded Israelis, and the broad coalition government will probably bring in some ministers that on certain domestic affairs will improve the lot of many Israelis. But unfortunately for the Palestinians, it probably won't make any difference at all. The likely next prime minister, Naftali Bennett, is actually to the right of Netanyahu, if you can imagine.
There is something to the right of Netanyahu?
Yes. I mean, he has been even more explicit in his determination to never see a Palestinian state alongside Israel. He has been even more racist in terms of his commentary about Palestinians, including Palestinian citizens of Israel. And he's definitely very, very much of a hardliner. I mean, I think his differences with Netanyahu were less ideological and more about personality and leadership style. So and he was willing to make, and he was therefore willing to make a coalition with many parties he disagrees with politically just to get rid of Netanyahu.
So, do you think he will make Bibi look better in a year from now?
It's hard to see. It depends on how the media covers it. I mean, I think Netanyahu in the United States, of course, Netanyahu's not been as popular as many previous Israeli prime ministers, in large part because of his close alliance to Donald Trump, his overt efforts to undermine foreign policy initiatives by President Obama and the like. Bennett is less well known, carries less baggage. And again, the having the presence of some more moderate to liberal parties in the broader coalition, might enable Israel to be portrayed in a more positive light. But on the other hand, the fact that Bennett has been so explicit in his opposition to Palestinian statehood might make it harder for the Biden administration to pretend that negotiations, the bilateral negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, will lead to a two-state solution. Let's remember that the successive U.S. administrations have told the Palestinians, you must not go through the United Nations to support statehood. You mustn't take any unilateral actions in terms of getting recognition by international organizations or foreign countries. International civil society efforts like the BDS campaign are wrong. The only path forward is through bilateral negotiations between the two parties. But if you have one of the two parties ruling out categorically even the possibility of a two-state solution, as we would have in future Prime Minister Bennett, that's going to be a harder argument to sell.
So, New York Times, one of the articles there is saying that Netanyahu was like President Trump, and this new coalition is like Biden. Do you agree with that?
No, it's more like a Liz Cheney, some in reference to the Republican House member who lost her post for her opposition to Trump, even though ideologically she was, if anything, to Trump's right. I mean, this is like a coalition between non-Trump Republicans and the Democratic Party, including some very conservative ones. So I would not. It would be very inaccurate, I think, to portray this new coalition as being comparable to Biden and the Democrats, even though taking into account the fact that Biden is well to the right of most Democrats when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian question.
What are the components of this emerging coalition? Well, before that, do you really think it's going to happen, or are there people are just talking about it while this process might reverse itself?
Well, I mean, they as of today, they do seem to have the 61 votes needed to the majority in the Israeli Knesset to form a government. But they have they have until next week, for a formal vote to take place. It sounds like they're moving ahead. It sounds like they're pretty confident. At the same time, Netanyahu and his supporters have been going to extreme measures to try to sabotage it. Not only hysterical, rhetoric, accusing these people of being far left wing, accusing them of allying with terrorists, and in fact threats against a number of the conservative Israeli members of the Knesset who have agreed to be part of this coalition. I mean, there have been protests outside of their houses and death threats and things like that. I mean, Netanyahu and his supporters are going to extremes. It is possible they could be successful, but I doubt it. Now, I should mention, however, that I have been interviewed over a dozen times, going all the way back to the 1990s, about the end of Netanyahu's career and writing his political obituary. And each time he has surprised everybody by coming back. So I don't want to sound overconfident either.
What are the components of this coalition? You mentioned, of course, the designated prime minister being given right of Netanyahu. Who are the other people?
Oh, it include the main bloc is Lapid's party, which is a centrist party. They tend to be more into challenging the increasing influence of the Orthodox and more conservative religious elements in society. Their position regarding the occupied territories are not particularly progressive, certainly not as far right as Netanyahu or Bennett, but unlikely to really push the issue. They really want to emphasize domestic issues. You have a number of other center-right, center-left parties in the mix, new parties. The two most prominent parties of the left would be the Labor Party, which was the dominant party in Israel for decades, particularly in its early going. They've always been open to the idea of land for peace, albeit under conditions that were never quite acceptable to even moderate Palestinians. And then you have Meretz, which is the most left party. They identify themselves as Zionists, but they are very much in the peace camp. They really support a near total withdrawal from the occupied territories. They oppose the oppose the settlement. This is a group, that if they were the main party, they probably could be peace, but I think they only have like a half dozen seats or anything. And then most interestingly, you have a small Islamist party made up of Palestinian citizens of Israel, who will not be formally part of the government, but in return for some minor concessions regarding the quality of life of Palestinian citizens of Israel, they have agreed to add their votes to get to the 61 to bring this new coalition over the top and get rid of Netanyahu.
So what are they in for?
It's unclear. Obviously, their willingness to be included in this has been very controversial within the Palestinian community. They are a conservative Islamist party, and that they differ from the more left-leaning and nationalist Palestinians on a number of issues. But it's a calculation that they think that on balance the situation regarding Arab citizens of Israel would be better under this coalition than with Netanyahu and his allies in power.
So they have 4 seats. Are there other Arab Palestinian groups?
Yes. There's the joint list, which has been running in various ways for a number of years. And they have I forget what the final total was, but slightly more than this Islamist grouping. They have refused on principle to ally with such hardline parties. They would ally with neither bloc.
All right. Well, tell us something which gives some hope.
It's a tough one, really, and I'm speaking as someone who has worked on Israel-Palestine since my young teens. It's been 50 years at this point of working for a just peace. And for many years, I was an advocate, for a viable two-state solution of a Palestinian state on the parts of historic Palestine that the international community recognizes as being under foreign belligerent occupation, that is the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, as a Palestinian state. And there are times in there are periods where things came rather close, but the Israelis were never really willing to make the necessary compromises to make that possible. And with a blank check from the United States, that is not just the unconditional military aid, but the loans to subsidize the settlements, the blocking the United Nations Security Council from taking any kind of action, and playing this contradictory role of being both the chief mediator in the peace process and the chief military, economic, and diplomatic supporter of one of the two parties. Things couldn't get very far. I mean, even if one takes the position that Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have equal rights to statehood and self-determination and peace and security, just saying the two sides who work it out among themselves ignores the gross asymmetry in power between the occupier and the occupied. That's like, saying like when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, that'd be like saying, oh, the Kuwaitis and Iraqis should work it out among themselves, how much of Kuwait and under what conditions Iraq should withdraw. The United Nations to stay out of it. I mean, obviously that was not the answer. I don't think war was necessarily the only option either. But my point being that this is that when you're in a situation of being under a foreign belligerent occupation, the onus to compromise is on the occupying power. I mean, what everyone thinks about Zionism or anything else. I mean, this is Israel's engaging in these kind of illegal actions. And so for years, I pushed the idea of a two-state solution in the occupation, and try to, based on basic principles of international law that supposedly the international community, led by the United States, codified in the United Nations Charter and the Fourth Geneva Conventions way back in the late 1940s. Now, however, I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that we need to shift from a talk of a two-state solution to talk of some kind of single binational state where both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have equal rights, and to move away from an anti-occupation struggle to an anti-apartheid struggle. And that's hard for a lot of us, but we need. I think there's still grounds tactically to differentiate between Israel and the occupation, especially when it does come to international law and that kind of thing. I think I guess if you want me to have offer hope, I think is that more and more people, including kind of mainstream moderates like myself, are no longer buying the pretense that a two-state solution is possible, and that the international community needs to join in with Palestinian civil society and their progressive Israeli allies, and to really work for towards a single state where there is equality and security guaranteed for all.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Zonis. Good to talk to you again.
My pleasure.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe and like for more content from MNTV. And feel free to visit our Facebook page for more top stories. Stay safe, and peace and blessings upon you all. Assalamu alaikum and good night.